She didn't know the language they were about to speak wasn't medical, it was power. When Dr. Camilla Voss walked into that hospital room, she thought she was dealing with a routine compliance investigation. But the moment that man looked at her and spoke her name, everything shifted. Not because of what was said, but because of what was understood without words. In less than a minute, she realized she wasn't being questioned. She was being measured. Every reaction, every silence, every breath was being studied like evidence in a case she never agreed to be part of. And somewhere outside of that room, a man she had only heard about in fragments, Dominic Reyes was already connected to her in ways she didn't yet have the language to explain. What started as a hospital inquiry was actually a test of identity, loyalty, and truth. And the most dangerous part? No one was telling the truth directly, because in their world, truth is something you survive, not something you speak. This is the moment where one wrong answer doesn't just cost your reputation, it rewrites your entire life. Welcome to a story about mafia boss intelligence, hidden power structures, and the kind of decisions that don't just change outcomes, they change who you become. This channel is about mafia boss stories, where some people are born to dominate and others learn too late what dominance really means. There are lessons life never teaches you. Only men who control entire systems understand them. This channel does not tell crime stories. It reveals mindset, discipline, and the hidden architecture of real power. The deeper lesson in the story is simple. You are always being evaluated by systems you cannot see. And the moment you understand that, you stop living casually and start thinking strategically about every choice, every person, every silence. If this story made you think differently, don't forget to like, comment where you're watching from, share with someone who needs a stronger mindset, and subscribe for more mafia boss level stories that change the way you see power.
The operating room at Massachusetts General Hospital had a way of erasing everything except precision. Time didn't feel like time in there. It felt like sequence, like rhythm, like breath measured against necessity. At 2 in the morning, the city as outside Boston was quiet, but inside the surgical suite, everything was alive and in controlled, almost sacred tension. Dr. Camilla Voss stood over an open skull, her hands steady in a way that came from years of repetition, not emotion. The monitors beside her pulsed with the patient's brain activity. Green lines tracing fragile patterns of life. Every movement she made was deliberate, every instruction soft but absolute. Suction, she said without looking up. Osir complied instantly, clamped the vessel at 2 millimeters, not more. Her voice didn't rise or fall. It didn't need to. There were moments in surgery when the world narrowed to a single point of survival. Camila lived in those moments better than she lived anywhere else. Outside the operating room, she often felt like an observer of her own life, moving through appointments, conversations, and empty dinners, like someone performing a role they had memorized too well. But here, inside the sterile brightness, she was certain of everything. Still, tonight felt different in a way she could name. Not fear, not fatigue. Something quieter, a disturbance at the edge of awareness, like a sound just beyond hearing. Bleeding controlled, one of the residents said. Good, Camila replied. Maintain pressure. Slowly seduce anesthesia. The surgery progressed with textbook precision. A ruptured aneurysm, delicate and dangerous, but nothing she hadn't handled before. Her reputation in the hospital was built on this kind of calm control cases others avoided, outcomes others called unlikely. Yet what made her exceptional wasn't just skill, it was perception. She noticed things most people missed: micro changes, hesitations, patterns in human behavior that revealed more than words ever could. It was a skill she never consciously learned. It simply existed in her, like a reflex. At 2:17 a.m., the patient stabilized. A small shift in the room's energy followed, subtle but real. The kind of collective exhale only surgeons understood. Camila stepped back slightly, eyes still on the monitors. Close carefully, she said, layer by layer. No shortcuts. As the team began closing the incision, her gaze drifted not to the patient, but to the corner monitor displaying hospital system alerts. A notification blinked briefly, then disappeared, then reappeared. Unauthorized access. Pharmaceutical supply log level 4 clearance required. She frowned slightly. It wasn't unusual for systems to glitch in a hospital this large, but something about the timing felt wrong. She a mental note and returned to the surgery. Dr. Voss, a nurse said softly. Patient stable. Good, she replied, but the feeling didn't leave. When the procedure finally ended, the room loosened its tension like a released breath. Gloves were removed. Instruments counted, voices softened into routine closure. Camila walked out of the operating room, as she always did quietly, without ceremony. The hallway outside felt colder than it should have. She removed her surgical cap and scrub mask, letting her dark hair fall loosely around her shoulders. For a moment, she stood still, watching a janitor push a cart at the far end of the corridor. Life outside surgery always felt slightly unreal to her, like stepping into a lower resolution version of the world. Her phone vibrated. A text from Dr. Nora Chen. Still alive out there? You've been in surgery for 6 hours. Come eat something. Eyes him, not asking. Camila almost smiled. Almost. I'm fine, she typed back, a lie, but an efficient one. She slipped her phone into her coat pocket and started walking toward her office. That was when she noticed something unusual. The administrative wing was quieter than normal, too quiet, even for this hour. The security desk was unmanned for a few seconds longer than it should have been. A door that usually remained locked showed a faint green light instead of red. She stopped walking. Camila wasn't paranoid by nature. She didn't imagine threats where none existed. Her mind didn't work that way, but it did register inconsistencies, and tonight there were too many. She approached the glass door slowly and scanned her ID badge. The lock clicked open. Inside, the corridor lights were dimmed. A faint hum from servers echoed through the walls. Her office was at the far end, but something else caught her attention first. A small envelope had been placed neatly on the floor, directly in front of her door. No stamp, no return address, just her name. Dr. Camila Voss, written in clean, deliberate handwriting. She stared at it for a long moment before picking it up. It felt heavier than paper should feel, though she knew that was irrational. Inside was a single sheet folded in half. No greeting, no explanation, just one line. You have been looking in the wrong direction for 3 months. Below it, an address in South Boston, and a signature. Dr. Her fingers went still. Not because she didn't understand what it meant, but because she did. Dominic Reyes, the name wasn't unfamiliar. It had been echoing in fragments through her life since her stepfather's death 3 months earlier. A conversation on a hospital bed. A confession made too late to undo anything. A man who had bought her life or rescued it, depending on which version of the story was true. Her stepfather had been dying when he told her. Cancer had already hollowed him out. His voice had been weak, uneven, as if even speaking cost him something. There's something you need to know, he had said. Camila remembered standing beside him, watching the machines instead of his face, because it was easier that way. I was to your real father, he whispered. I was the one who took you after the deal went wrong. She had frozen, not because she understood, but because she did. Then came the name. Dominic Reyes. He said it like a warning, or a confession. Then he added, barely audible, he thinks you re-gone. After that, there had been silence, and then death. And then 3 months of surgery documentations that didn't quite align with anything real. Camila stood in the hospital corridor, holding the envelope, feeling something shift, not emotionally, but structurally, like a foundation adjusting under pressure. She looked at the address in South Boston, a warehouse district. Old shipping lanes turned into private facilities and offshore logistics hubs. Places where hospitals didn't usually send invitations. Her first instinct was sensible. Discard it. She even turns slightly toward the trash bin at the end of the corridor. But she didn't throw it away. Instead, she folded it carefully and placed the toast inside her coat pocket. Then she burned it in her mind. That was her method. If something needed to be erased, she made sure it was remembered first. She walked to her office, opened up her laptop. She told herself she would forget it by morning, that it was a distraction, that it didn't matter. But her eyes kept drifting back to the clock. And the part she didn't say out loud, the part she refused to give language to, was that she already knew she was going to go. But 3 days later, the hospital received an unexpected regulatory notice, a pharmaceutical audit, not routine, not random, targeted, specific to controlled anesthetics and surgical sedatives. Camila read the memo twice before she squint in department fully processed it. There were discrepancies in the supply chain, minor on paper, but systematic in pattern, and she recognized the pattern because she had seen it before, not in reports, in people. That afternoon, she stood alone in her office longer than usual. Nora had texted again, this time with concern instead of humor. Camila didn't reply. Outside her window, Boston moved as if nothing was changing, but inside her, something had already begun to shift. At 7:40 p.m., she left the hospital. She did not tell anyone where she was going. She did not need to. She already knew. And somewhere in South Boston, in a building that officially did not exist on most maps, a man named Dominic Reyes was already waiting, not because he expected her arrival at that exact moment, but because men like him did not believe in coincidence. They believed in patterns. And Camila Voss, whether she understood it yet or not, had just become part of his. The building in South Boston did not look like what Camila's had expected, and that alone unsettled her more than anything else so far. Expectations were useful in medicine. They created a baseline for comparison, a way to measure deviation. But here, expectation failed immediately. From the outside, the structure resembled an abandoned logistics warehouse, old brick. Faded industrial signage, rusted loading docks that had not seen conscious use in years. Even the street around it felt forgotten, as if the city had quietly agreed to pretend nothing important ever happened there. Camila parked 2 blocks away, not because she was afraid, but because she was careful. Careful was not the same as cautious. Careful meant she had already accepted the possibility of consequences, and simply chosen to proceed with awareness. She turned off the engine and sat for a moment, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. Her pulse was steady. That was the first thing she always expected in situations like this. Not emotion, not logic, but rhythm. The body rarely lied unless it was forced to. Nothing unusual. She stepped out of the car and walked toward the warehouse. The air smelled faintly of salt and metal, like the ocean was nearby but unwilling to commit to presence. A single security camera above the entrance tracked her movement without moving. She noticed it immediately, of course, but did not react. Cameras were not threats. People behind them were. At the entrance, there was no visible doorbell, no keypad, no sign of controlled access. Just a heavy steel door, with a subtle seam that suggested engineering more advanced than its appearance allowed. She raised her hand and knocked once. No hesitation, no second thought. A long pause followed, not empty, but deliberate. The kind of pause that was not waiting for information's confession. Then the door unlocked. It opened inward without sound. Camila stepped inside. The contrast was immediate. The interior was not a warehouse. It was a controlled environment disguised as one. Clean lines, polished concrete and floors, subtle lighting embedded into architectural seams. Everything had been designed to hide intention rather than express it. Even the silence felt manufactured. She took a few steps forward before the door closed behind her. Only then did she see him. Dominic Reyes was seated at a table in the center of the room, not behind a desk. Not elevated, not positioned like someone trying to assert its dominance through placements. He was simply there, as if he had waited being long enough that standing would have been unnecessary. He did not rise when she entered. That detail more than it should have. Most powerful men, especially men like him, men whose reputations were built of fear, subtle and absence of accountability to their performed presence. They stood, they asserted, they reminded. Dominic did none of that. Instead, he looked at her as if she had arrived exactly when expected. Not early, not late. Just correctly. Dr. Voss, he said. His voice was calm. Not warm, not cold. Neutral in a way that felt intentional. Camila did not respond immediately. She studied him first, the way she would observe a patient before speaking. Mid-40s. Controlled posture. Hands resting loosely on the table. Not hidden, not exposed. No visible weapon, though that meant nothing in a place like this. The absence of tension, his body was more telling than tension itself. You burned the note, he continued. Her eyes narrowed slightly. But you memorized the address. A faint pause. That tells me everything I needed to know about you. Camila finally spoke. Then you already know why I am here. I know why you think Yuri here, he corrected gently. That correction landed differently than an insult would have. Insults were simple. Corrections implied observation, understanding, even authority. She took one step closer. You contacted me. I did. Why? He leaned back slightly, studying her the way she had been studying him, not as an opponent, not as an ally, as something unclassified. Flows, he said slowly. You've been circling a truth 3 months without realizing it has already noticed you. Camila's expression did not change, but something inside her shifted, not fear, not recognition, something closer to alignment. You don't even know what I am looking for, she said. I know exactly what you're looking for, Dominic replied. The certainty in his voice was not arrogance, it was familiarity. That was more unsettling than any threat. For the first time since entering the building, Camila felt the subtle pressure of uncertainty. Not about her safety, but about her interpretation of reality. That was always more dangerous. She crossed her arms. Then tell me. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached forward and placed a thin folder on the table between them. Inside were documents, hospital records, old shipping manifests, a name that appeared repeatedly in different contexts but never officially connected. Camila did not touch it yet. You work in neurosurgery, Dominic said. You understand systems, damage patterns, causality. Yes. Then you understand that nothing in a system is isolated. Her gaze remained fixed on the folder. What is this? Evidence, he said simply. For what? For why your stepfather died with unfinished sentences. That sentence hit differently. Not emotionally. Structurally, because it acknowledged something she had not said out loud to anyone, not even herself. That her stepfather's confession had not been complete. That it had been interrupted by fear, or pain, or something else entirely. Camila opened the folder. Inside were names she recognized from hospital procurement logs, controlled substances, anesthetic distribution chains, patterns of diversion that matched the anomaly she had noticed 3 days earlier during surgery. Her eyes moved faster now, scanning, connecting, reconstructing. You retelling me, she said quietly, that our hospital supply chain is compromised. I'm telling you, Dominic recorrected, that your hospital is one node in a system that has been operating for years without detection because it wears the right paperwork. Camila looked up. And you were part of it. A pause. Not defensive. Not reactive. Just measured. Yes, he said. The honesty of it was disorienting. Most criminals denied, or justified, or reframed. Dominic did none of that. Camila closed the folder slowly. Why tell me this? Because you were going to find it an answer. It is, as he said, if you understand timing. Steps closer now, stopping just across the table from him. The distance between them was no longer physical. It was conceptual. A boundary formed by information rather than space. You don't know me, she said. Dominic eyes hers fully now. I know enough, he replied. You needn't panic. You needn't seize. You verify before you decide. That makes you dangerous in ways most people don't recognize until it's too late. Camila almost smiled at that, almost. And what exactly am I supposed to do with this information? She asked. Nothing, he said. That surprised her. For the first time, some expression flickered. You brought me here to tell me nothing? I brought you here, Dominic said, so you would stop pretending you didn't already know something was wrong. Silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, but dense. Camila studied him again more carefully this time. There was something about his restraint that did not match expectation. Men like him, in stories and assumptions, in fear-based imagination, were supposed to dominate the space, fill silence, apply pressure, not. He allowed silence to exist without trying to control it. That, in its own way, was control. You didn't threaten me, she said finally. No, you didn't try to intimidate me. He tilted his head slightly. Would that have helped? The question was almost clinical. Camila did not answer immediately, because the honest answer was no. She realized something uncomfortable in that moment. Intimidation was irrelevant to her. She responded to logic, structure, truth, not fear, not performance. Dominic had already understood that. That realization shifted the entire dynamic of the room. You knew I would come, she said. I suspected, he corrected again. You varies with language, she noted. I have to be, he said. People misunderstand everything else. Camila looked down at the folder again, then back at him. And what do you want from me? This time, he paused longer. When he spoke, his tone did not change, but the weight behind it did. I don't want anything from you, he said. That answer should have been relieving. And instead, it felt like the most dangerous thing he had said so far, because it implied she was not recruited. She was being observed, or positioned. Camille straightened slightly. Then why am I here? Dominic looked at her for a long moment, not analyzing her body language, not measuring reaction, just looking. He says, because Victor Sasazar has started asking questions about you. The name landed with clarity, not fear, context. Camila had heard it before in administrative whispers, in procurement anomalies, in indirect references buried inside compliance reports. A name that did not belong to any official system but influenced all of them. And you think that matters to me? She asked. It will, Dominic said simply. She exhaled slowly through her nose. You re-assuming aim involved in something I don't understand, no. He replied, I replied. I assuming you already in something you haven't named yet. That was the first time she stopped speaking, not because she had nothing to say, but because she was evaluating whether anything she said would matter more than what he already understood. The silence stretched. Then Dominic pushed the folder slightly closer to her. There S as a reasons I didn't send someone else, he said, and it S not, because I trust you. Kamziza raised his eyebrow slightly. Then why? Because you notice things people like me usually rely on staying unnoticed. That was not a compliment. It was a classification. Camila closed the folder again. If I walk away from this, she said carefully, what happens? Nothing, Dominic said. That sounds likely. It is T, she studied him again. For the first time since entering, she felt something shift not in him, but in the structure of the conversation itself. He was not pulling her in. He was not pushing her away. He was simply stating reality as he understood it, without emotional leverage. That was rarer than persuasion. It was neutrality with awareness. I need time, she said finally. You have it, Dominic replied. No resistance, no conditions. That, more than anything, confirmed that this was not a negotiation. It was a recognition. Camila turned slightly toward the exit, then paused. Without looking back, she asked, why me? A long silence followed. When Dominic finally answered, his voice was lower, not softer, just more contained. Because people usually ask the wrong questions, he said. You done tea. She left without spending. And for the first time since she had walked into the building, Dominic Reyes did not watch her like a variable in a system. He watched her like a confirmation of something he had been waiting a very long time to see. Not arrival, not danger, but alignment. Camilla did not sleep that night, not because she was afraid, and not because her mind was racing in the way people usually describe stress. It was something more precise than that. Her thoughts were organized, almost too organized, as if her brain had shifted into a higher level of clinical processing where emotion was temporarily removed from interpretation. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling of her apartment in Boston, replaying the conversation in South Boston over and over again, not the words alone, but the structure of it, the rhythm of pauses, the way Dominic Reyes spoke, as if silence itself was part of the dialogue. There was something unsettling about a man who did not try to fill silence. Most people did. Doctors did it with reassurance. Criminals did it with intimidation. Patients did it with fear. Even the smartest people she knew used words like insulation against uncertainty. But Dominic had done none of that. He allowed space to exist between sentences without rushing to control it. And in that space, F had felt something she did not usually allow herself to feel in professional environments. She had felt observed without being judged. It was a strange distinction, but an important one. Judgment implied bias. Observation implied accuracy. And accuracy in her world was always more dangerous. At 5:12 a.m., she gave up on sleep and got out of bed. The city outside her window was still dark. but the horizon carried the faintest trace of blue. She stood in silence for a moment, then walked to her kitchen and made coffee she did not need. Her movements were automatic, but her mind was not idle. It was reconstructing everything she had seen in that warehouse room: the folder, the documents, the controlled supply chains, the name Victor Salazar, and most importantly, the absence of pressure. Dominic had not forced her into anything. That fact bothered her more than coercion would have, because coercion was easy to categorize. It had intent, direction, and moral clarity. But absence of coercion created ambiguity, and ambiguity was where systems became dangerous. By the time she arrived at the hospital that morning, she had already decided she would not mention the meeting to anyone. Not because she was hiding something, but because she did not yet have enough structure around the situation to explain it in a way that would survive scrutiny. Doctors were trained to avoid speculation without evidence. She was no different in that regard. If anything, she was stricter than most. Still, something had changed. It was not external. Nothing in her environment had shifted visibly. The hospital looked the same. The halls the same. The familiar rhythm of nurses, interns, and administrative chatter moved through the building like it always did. But Camila noticed more than usual that morning. Not in a dramatic sense, not like a revelation, but like a recalibration of attention. She noticed who avoided eye contact with who paused slightly before answering questions, who checked messages more often than necessary. She noticed inside conversations that previously had been invisible because she had not been looking for them. That was the real effect of Dominic Reagis. He had not given her information. He had changed the way she observed information. At 7:30 a.m., she was already in surgery preparation for a complex neurosurgical case involving a traumatic intracranial hemorrhage. The patient was stable but critical, and the team moved with practiced urgency. Camila stood at the center of it all, speaking in the same calm, controlled tone she always used. We open at the coronal suture. Slow separation. No unnecessary pressure on the temporal region, she instructed. The room responded instantly. Her authority was not questioned because it never needed reinforcement. But even here, inside the operating room, her mind was not fully present. It kept drifting back to one specific detail from the night before. Dominic had known her name before she entered the room. Not just her name, her behavior, her tendencies. That meant preparation. But preparation of what kind? Surveillance, research, or something more subtle institutional? She pushed that aside as the surgery began. For the next 3 hours, Camila was exactly what she always was: precise, focused, detached. Her hands moved with surgical certainty. Her voice remained steady. The patient's condition stabilized gradually under her direction. If anyone in the room noticed any deviation in her behavior, they did not comment on it. From the outside, she was unchanged. But something was shifting in a way she could not yet name. At 11:48 a.m., as the procedure concluded successfully, a resident leaned toward her. Dr. Voss, you have a consult scheduled at 1 p.m. with hospital administration regarding the anesthetic supply review. She nodded without looking up. I know. That was new. She did not remember confirming the meeting, but she also did not question it out loud. By the time she reached her office, Nora Chen was already waiting. Nora was the kind of person who filled a room without trying. Not loud, not aggressive, but present in a way that made absence noticeable. She was seated in one of the chairs, opposite Camila's desk, holding a cup of coffee she had clearly brought for both of them. You look like you didn't sleep, Nora said immediately. Camila closed the door behind her. I didn't. That's not like you. It is recently, Camila replied. Nora studied her for a moment. Do you want to talk about it? Camila set her bag down carefully. No. Nora nodded once, accepting the answer without pushing. That was one of the reasons Camila tolerated her presence more than most people. Nora understood boundaries, even when she did not understand context. Instead, Nora changed direction. There's something weird happening with hospital procurement. Camila's attention sharpened slightly. Though she did not show it, Nora continued. 3 departments reported inconsistencies in controlled anesthetic deliveries. Not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to create patterns if someone was looking for them. Camila sat down slowly. Who S looking for them? Nora shrugged. No one officially. That S the problem. It S like the system is half visible. Camila did not respond immediately, because she already knew the answer. Or at least, she suspected she did. Later that afternoon, Camila attended the administrative meeting regarding supply chain review. The room was overly polished in a way that suggested deliberate control of perception. Glass table, soft lighting, carefully selected participants. The hospital administrator leading the meeting spoke in measured tones about efficiency optimization and minor discrepancies in logistical coordination. Camila listened without interruption. But she noticed something else. There were too many defensive explanations for something that was supposedly minor. People do not over-explain what they are confident about. They over-explain what they are protecting. When the meeting ended, she returned to her office and closed the door. For a long moment, she stood in silence, then opened her laptop. She pulled up hospital supply records, accessing layers of data most clinicians never bothered to examine. At first, everything looked normal. Clean logs, standard entries, approved distributions. But then she started filtering differently. Not by department, not by date, but by deviation patterns. That was when she saw it. A repetition structure hidden beneath administrative legitimacy. Small inconsistencies that individually meant nothing, but together formed a chain. Not a random chain, a controlled one. Distribution points that aligned not with medical need, but with external routing logic. Camila leaned slightly in her chair. This was not negligence. It was design, and design meant intention. Her phone vibrated, unknown number. She stared at it for a moment before answering. Dr. Voss, a calm male voice said on the other end. She did not respond immediately. I trust you found the folder useful, voice of her continued. She recognized it instantly. Dominikas Freikas Patas, you accessed hospital records, she said. Yes, except you just found, he replied evenly. Stretched between them, not uncomfortable. Informational. As Camille looked at her screen, but you re-embedded in our supply chain. I'm adjacent to it, he corrected. That S not the same sheen thing. It is when you control the edges. She stood up slowly and walked toward the window. Why are you telling me this over the phone? Because you would have found it within days anyway, Dominic said. And because I prefer accuracy over suspense. Camila exhaled slowly. What do you want from me? There was always a brief pause on the line. When he put its guinedist, his tone shifted slightly, not emotionally, but structurally. I want you to stop thinking in terms of good and bad systems, he said. That S not how this works. Camila's grip tightened slightly on her phone. Then how does it work in terms of necessity? She turned back toward her desk. That's answer. It is, he said. It just isn't the one you like. Another pause. Then Camila said something she did not fully plan. You didn't threaten me yesterday. You didn't manipulate me. You just showed me information, yes. Why? This time, Dominic did not respond immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter. Because people like you don't respond to pressure, he said. You respond to truth. That sentence stayed in the air longer than expected. Camila looked at the hospital data again. And what happens if I decide to walk away from this? Then you walk away, he said simply. No resistance, no consequence stated. That should have been reassuring. Instead, it created something else. Certainty. Because people who truly hold power rarely feel the need to prevent others from leaving. They only ensure that leaving does not change anything. Camila closed her laptop slowly. You not trying to recruit me? She said. No, Dominic replied. You not trying to intimidate me? No. Then what is this? A long silence followed. When he answered, his voice carried something she had not heard before. Not vulnerability. Not emotion. Something closer to recognition. Observation, he said. Camila stood still. That S all? That S all it has been from the beginning. The line went quiet. She lowered the phone slightly, staring at the wall as if it might offer clarification that words could not. For the first time since she had entered Dominic Reyes' world, she understood something fundamental. She was not inside a negotiation. She was inside a system that had already accounted for her presence before she agreed to participate in it. And somewhere in that realization was the beginning of a question she had not yet formed fully enough to ask. By the time Camila Voss stepped into the hospital that morning, something about the building felt different, even though nothing visible had changed. The marble floors were still polished to the same sterile shine, the elevators still hummed with their familiar mechanical patience, and the corridors still carried the quiet urgency of a place where life and death negotiated every second without ever agreeing on terms. And yet, she noticed things she had never prioritized before: small behavioral inconsistencies, subtle time delays in administrative movement, the way certain staff members avoided walking in pairs near restricted zones. It was not paranoia. Camila did not operate on paranoia. She operated on pattern recognition, and patterns once seen could not be unseen. She had not told anyone about the phone call from Dominic Reyes the night before. She had not told Nora, had not filed out anything with administration, had not written it down even in her private notes. Instead, she had done what she always did when faced with incomplete information. She expanded the dataset. She accessed procurement logs again, cross-referenced anesthetic distribution schedules, and ran comparisons as departments that were not usually analyzed together. Wait, what she found did not present itself as a revelation. It presented itself as repetition. Repetition was more dangerous than anomaly because anomaly could be dismissed as error. Repetition implied design. At 7:12 a.m., she was called into a meeting she had not scheduled. The message came from hospital administration, brief and procedural, a mandatory compliant review regarding controlled substances distribution. Attendance required. She stared at the notification for several seconds, longer than necessary. Mandatory reviews did not typically appear without preliminary discussion. She arrived into the meeting room 10 minutes early. The space was designed to reduce tension without eliminating authority. Neutral colors, soft lighting, glass wall solds that created transparency without actual exposure. There were 5 people already present when she entered: 2 administrative officers, 1 compliance auditor, 1 pharmacy logistics coordinator, and a representative from external consulting services, whose presence was not explained in the agenda. Camila noticed immediately that none of them looked surprised to see her. That detail mattered. Surprise indicated lack of expectation. Absence of surprise indicated anticipation. She sat down without speaking. The meeting began on time. It was framed as routine. Minor discrepancies in controlled anesthetic tracking, occasional delays in reporting, and inconsistencies between electronic logs and physical inventory. The language used was deliberately soft, almost therapeutic in tone. System inefficiencies, one administrator said. Minor miscellaneous, another added. Nothing structurally concerning. Camila listened without interruption. But she was not listening to the words. She was listening to what the words were protecting. When people over-explained stability, it usually meant instability had already been normalized. She opened her notebook but did not write anything yet. Instead, she observed. The pharmacy coordinator avoided eye contact when speaking. The external consultant checked his phone twice within the first 10 minutes without any visible notification trigger. The compliance auditor paused slightly before every reassurance, as if each sentence required internal approval before external release. Camila had seen these patterns before, not in hospitals, in operating rooms when something was about to go wrong, and everyone in the room unconsciously knew it before the monitors confirmed it. After 30 minutes, the meeting concluded with no actionable resolution. That was also a pattern. When systems were truly stable, meetings ended with clarity. When systems were unstable but protected, they ended with ambiguity. As she left the room, one of the administrators called after her, "Dr. Voss, if you notice anything unusual in your department, please report it through proper channels." She stopped briefly but did not turn around. "I already have," she said. Then she continued walking. By midday, Camila was in surgery. A traumatic intracranial hemorrhage, high risk, low margin for error, the kind of case that demanded full cognitive presence. And for a few hours, she allowed herself to return to the simplicity of surgical logic. Bleeding either stopped or it did not. Pressure either stabilized or it escalated. Intervention either succeeded or failed. In the operating room, ambiguity did not survive. Clamp at the anterior branch, she instructed calmly. Careful, too much pressure will rupture the secondary vessel. Her team responded instantly. Inside the sterile environment, she was exactly who she had always been, precise, controlled, unaffected. But even here, fragments of the external world kept intruding at the edges of her awareness, not emotionally, but structurally. The hospital outside this room was no longer neutral in her mind. It had gained architecture she could now partially see. Systems always looked simple until you understood what they were hiding. When the surgery concluded successfully, she stepped out of the operating room and removed her gloves. The hallway outside felt colder than usual, not physically but perceptually, as if the building itself had become more aware of her presence. Her phone vibrated. Unknown number. She already knew, before answering, Dr. Voss. The voice said, calm, controlled. Familiar now, in a way she had known but had begun to accept. Dominic, she replied. A brief pause followed, as if he acknowledged the correctness of her recognition. You attended the compliance meeting, he said. Yes. They did not tell you the truth. Camila stopped walking. She stepped slightly aside into a quieter section of the corridor. That meeting was about supply inconsistencies. It was about exposure control, he corrected. Her grip tightened slightly on the phone. That's not the same thing. It is in practice, he said. Camille closed her eyes briefly, not in frustration, but in recalibration. What exactly is being controlled? There was a pause on the line, longer than before. When Dominic spoke again, his tone had shifted not emotionally, but in density. The pharmaceutical supply chain feeding your hospital is not isolated, he said. It connects to 3 other hospitals in the region. It routes through licensed distributors that appear legitimate on paper. And it is monitored at points where audits are predictable, not where diversion occurs. Camila listened carefully, not interrupting, not reacting, just absorbing structure. You re-saying it's intentional, she said siphoning. Yes, and you re-part of it. I operate within it, he corrected. Camila exhaled slowly. That sounds like semantics. It's precision, he replied. Silence followed. Silence, Camila walked toward the stairwell instead of the elevator. She needed movement, not escape. Movement helped processing. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. Why are you telling me this? Because Victor Salazar is expanding his reach, Dominic said, and because your hospital is no longer just a node. It's becoming a leverage point. Camila stopped near the stairwell door. Who is Salazar to you? She asked. Another pause, not hesitation, calculation. A man who believes systems can be owned, Dominic said finally. That's not an answer. It is, he replied. It just requires context. Camila leaned slightly against the wall, processing. And I'm supposed to believe you protecting me from him? No, Dominic said immediately. You are not a target because of protection. That makes no sense. Does if you understand proximity. Kemsley frowned slightly, explained. You are close to systems he is trying to destabilize, Dominic said. And you are noticing things most people ignore. That accompanying creates exposure. Camila looked down the empty corridor. So I'm collateral. No, he said. You visibility. That word stayed with her longer than expected. Visibility implied awareness. It implied being seen, not targeted, not controlled, observed. There was a difference she could not ignore. I don't know what role you think I have in this, she said. You don't need to know yet, Dominic replied. That answer should have been dismissive. Instead, it felt intentional. Camila pushed off the wall and started walking again. You keep speaking like I'm already inside something I haven't agreed to. You are, he said simply. That's not how consent works. A brief pause. Then Dominic said, systems don't wait for consent. They wait for recognition. That line created a quiet stillness in her mind. Not agreement. Not rejection. Recognition of logic. She reached her office and closed the door behind her. For a moment, she stood still, then opened her laptop again. This time, she did not look at surface-level procurement data. She went deeper, accessing cross-institutional logs, comparing timestamps across facilities, tracing supply inconsistencies through indirect pathways. What she found was not a single breach. It was architecture. a layered structure of controlled inefficiency, not chaos, not corruption in the traditional sense. Something more advanced, a system designed to look imperfect in ways that made investigations self-limiting. Every anomaly was small enough to be dismissed. Every pattern was distributed enough to avoid detection thresholds. It was elegant, and it was real. Her phone vibrated again. This time she did not hesitate. Yes, she answered. You see it now, Dominic said. It was not a question, Camila stared at her screen. Shouldn't exist at this scale. It should a T, he agreed. Then why does it? A pause. Because this time his answer carried weight beyond information. Because systems evolve faster than the people who regulate them, he said. And because most people mistake legality for control. Camila sat down slowly. And what does that make you? She asked. There was a long silence on the line. When Dominic spoke again, his voice was quieter than before. Someone who learned to survive inside it, he said. Camila leaned back in her chair, eyes still fixed on the data. For the first time since she had met him, she understood something that did not feel like manipulation or persuasion. It felt like alignment of perspective, not agreement, recognition of shared visibility. And somewhere in that realization, the structure of her world hospital, systems, assumptions, boundaries shifted slightly, not breaking, but reorganizing around information she could no longer unsee. Camila Voss began feigning the same way she always did when something inside her refused to settle into normal rhythm. She returned to structure. Structure was her form of control when emotion became unreliable. And she had learned long ago that emotions were not dangerous because they were strong, but because they were imprecise. At 5:40 a.m., before the hospital fully woke, she was already reviewing surgical schedules, cross-checking patient intake data, and scanning updated pharmacy logs from 3 different departments. The world outside her apartment was still dark, but her mind had already moved into operational mode, where everything could be measured, compared, and verified. And yet, even within that discipline, something kept interrupting her focus. Not thoughts, not fear, fragments. A sound she could not fully place. A word half remembered in a language she was not supposed to understand. Sicilian. It surfaced in her mind the way a ghost might pass through a locked door, not fully formed, not fully gone, but persistent enough to disturb the architecture of certainty she depended on. She paused over a patient file longer than necessary. That alone was unusual. Camila did not pause without reason. Her phone sat beside her laptop, silent. No messages, no calls, no disruptions from Nora, no administrative requests, no surgical emergencies. And yet the silence felt heavier than noise. It was the kind of silence that suggested something had already been set in motion without her awareness. At 6:30 a.m., she left for the hospital earlier than usual. Boston was waking slowly, streets still wet from overnight mist, city lights reflecting off asphalt like fragments of unfinished thoughts. Camila drove without music, without distraction. Her mind replayed the same question she had not allowed herself to fully articulate since meeting Dominic Reyes. Why did certain details feel familiar even when they should not have been? By the time she reached the hospital, she had already decided she would not engage with anything unrelated to patient care. That decision lasted exactly 47 minutes. At 7:17 a.m., a message appeared in her internal hospital system flagged under historical audit reconciliation. It was not urgent, not high priority, and most doctors would have ignored it. But Camila did not ignore anomalies. She opened it. The document was old, fragmented, partially redacted under compliance restrictions that no longer matched current policy frameworks. It contained references to a pediatric intake record from nearly 25 years ago, a case involving an unidentified child transferred under emergency guardianship authorizations. No official name, only a temporary classification code. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she scanned the metadata. Then she saw something that made her stop breathing for half a second, not emotionally, but physiologically, as if the body itself had registered a misalignment. The notes included a line of communication recorded by a staff member at the time. The child had spoken intermittently in Sicilian. Camila leaned back slowly in her chair. That detail should not have mattered. Children exposed to multiple environments sometimes picked up linguistic fragments. It was not unusual in itself, but what made it significant was not the language, it was the combination of language and medical classification. The record indicated neurological sensitivity patterns inconsistent with developmental environment. In clinical terms, it suggested exposure structured language learning before cognitive stabilization age. She stared at the screen longer than necessary, then closed it, not because she was finished, but because she was not yet ready to continue. At 9:90 a.m., she entered surgery. For several hours, she became what she always became inside the operating room: precise, detached, completely anchored in physical reality. There was no ambiguity in neurosurgery. Either the vessel was repaired or it was not. Either the brain stabilized or it did not. Life was not symbolic in that environment. It was mechanical, fragile, and immediate. Slow retraction, she instructed calmly. Do not increase pressure. We read close to the corticospinal boundary. Her team responded without hesitation. Inside the operating room, she was not Dr. Camilla Voss the person. She was Dr. Camilla Voss the function. And functions did not question themselves. But when the surgery ended successfully and she stepped out into the corridor, the fragments returned immediately, as if waiting just outside the sterile boundaries of clinical control. A word, a tone, a memory that did not feel like memory. At 11:43 a.m., she received a call. She already knew who it was before she answered. Yes, she said. Dr. Voss, Dominic Reyes responded. His voice was steady, as always. Not intrusive, not warm. Present. Camila walked toward a quieter hallway. You recalling early. I don't operate on your schedule, he replied. That sounds intentional. It is. She stopped near a window overlooking the hospital courtyard. What do you want? A brief pause followed. Not hesitation calibration. I want to know if you accessed historical patient archives, he said. Camilla's expression tightened slightly. That S, not your domain. It overlaps, he replied. Silence stretched between them. Then she said, Why would I access those? Because you noticed the same inconsistency I did, Dominic said. That sentence landed differently. Not as confirmation, as alignment. Camilla's grip tightened slightly around her phone. You already know what I found. I know what you. Reapproaching, he corrected. She exhaled slowly. The pediatric intake record. Yes. That was the first time he had confirmed something without prompting. Camila turned away from the window. Why is that relevant to anything happening now? Another pause. When Dominic spoke again, his tone shifted slightly, not emotionally, but in depth. Because systems don't to begin where people think they do, he said. They begin earlier, and they repeat patterns. Camila frowned. You were suggesting a connection between a 25-year-old case and current pharmaceutical distribution networks. I am not suggesting, he replied. I am observing continuity. She closed her eyes briefly. That is not evidence. No, he said. It is direction. Silence followed again. Camila began walking without realizing it, moving through the corridor as if motion could stabilize thought. Why does this feel familiar? She asked quietly, almost to herself. There was a pause on the line that felt longer than before. When Dominic answered, his voice was lower. Because you were closer to it than you realize, he said. That sentence should have sounded manipulative. But it did not. It sounded precise. Camila stopped walking. What does that mean? She asked. Another pause. Then, Dominic said, it means memory is not always stored where you expect it to be. That answer did not clarify anything, but it destabilized something. Camila returned to her office immediately after ending the call. She did not speak to anyone on the way. Nora texted her once asking if she wanted coffee. She did not respond. Instead, she closed her door and reopened the archival file. This time, she did not read it casually. She dissected it, line by line, metadata by metadata, timestamps, staff annotations, report logs, interdepartmental signatures. Everything that had once been administrative noise now became structured signal, and beneath it, she noticed a gap, not in data, in continuity, a missing connection point between intake and discharge records that should not exist unless intentionally removed. That was not error, that was intervention. Her phone rang again. She answered immediately. Yes? You found it, Dominic Sang said. Camila did not respond, not because she disagreed, but because she was no longer sure what it referred to. After a moment, she said, "This file has been altered." "Yes." "By whom?" Then Dominic answered, "People who believed they were preventing a collapse." Camila leaned back in her chair slowly. "That's not an explanation." "It is," he said. "It just does not satisfy curiosity." That was the first time she almost smiled, almost. But it did not reach her expression fully. Instead, she said, "Why are you involved in this?" A longer pause followed. When Dominic spoke again, his voice carried something quieter than usual. "It's because systems like the one you re-looking at don't to stay contained," he said. "They expand until someone either understands them or becomes part of them." Camila looked at her screen again. The pediatric file remained open, still incomplete, still suggestive, still unresolved. "Yuri saying this connects to Salazar," she said. "I'm saying Salazar understands parts of it," Dominic replied. "And you understand?" A pause. Then, yes. Camila closed her eyes briefly. The word was not dramatic, but it was final. She opened them again. "Why show me this now?" There was silence on the line for several seconds. When Dominic finally answered, his voice shifted slightly, not softer, but more deliberate. "Because you are already inside it," he said. Camila stood up slowly. "That's not possible," she said. "It is," he replied. "You just didn't have language for it before now." That sentence lingered longer than anything else in the conversation. Language, that word again. Camila turned toward the window. Outside, Boston moved in its usual rhythm: cars, pedestrians, cystrons, life continuing without awareness of structural undercurrents beneath it all. She spoke quietly. "The child in that file, why does Sicilian appear in the notes?" A pause, a longer one this time. When Dominic answered, his was voices low born. "Because someone taught it to her," he said. Kamafasa froze slightly, not emotionally, structurally. "That S not enough to connect anything," she said. "No," Dominic agreed, "but it's enough to start remembering." Silence. For the first time since she had met him, Camila did not immediately respond. Because something inside her, something she had never given permission to surface, shifted. Not fully formed, not fully understood, but present enough to change the direction of every assumption she had made about herself, her past, and the systems she had begun to see but not yet fully comprehend. And somewhere in that silence, the idea of memory itself stopped being something she controlled and started becoming something that was already controlling her. Camila Voss did not go home that night. Not because she was running from anything in the physical sense, but because returning to her apartment would have required a level of emotional processing she was not yet prepared to engage in. Instead, she stayed at the hospital long after her shift had officially ended, sitting alone in her office with the lights dimmed and the city of Boston stretching silently beyond the glass window, like a distant organism she was no longer sure she belonged to. The pediatric file remained open on her screen. She had read it so many times by now that the words no longer felt like information. They had become structure anchors of something incomplete, fragments of a narrative that refused to stabilize into a single interpretation. Sicilian language references, neurological observations, missing continuity between intake and discharge. Administrative corrections that looked too precise to be accidental and too subtle to be obvious. And beneath all of it, the same invisible tension she could not ignore anymore. This was not just a medical case. It had never been just a medical case. At 9:17 p.m., her phone vibrated. She already knew who it was before she looked. "Yes," she answered quietly. "Still at the hospital," Dominic Raydre said. It was not a question. Camila leaned back slightly at her air. "You read Tracky's my schedule now?" "No," he replied. "You read just consistent." That answer should have been dismissive, but it wasn't tea. It was observational in the same way she observed surgical patterns, detached, precise, almost clinical. She closed her laptop slightly. "I found the missing discharge linkage." A pause followed on the line. Then Dominic said, "I expected you would." Camilla frowned slightly. "You expected it?" "Yes." Why? Another pause, longer this time, not hesitant, but waited. "Because the same structure appears in other places," he said. Camila stood up slowly and walked toward the window. "You referring to me as a Salazar's network. I am referring to systems that learned how to hide themselves inside legitimate infrastructure," Dominic corrected. Silence settled between them. Outside, Boston moved with its usual indifference, traffic lights changing, ambulances passing in the distance, people living inside systems they did not consciously perceive. Camila spoke again, quieter now. You said I was already inside it. Yes, then explain it. There was a long pause. When Dominic answered, his voice had shifted slightly, not emotionally, but in density, as if he had moved from surface explanation to foundational truth. You looking at a medical distribution network, he said. But what you actually seeing is an adaptation layer. It routes pharmaceuticals through institutions that appear legitimate, but it also routes information through the same channels. Data, access permissions, historical records, everything is layered. Camila listened without interruption, not because she agreed, but because she understood enough to know he wasn't speaking in metaphor. And the pediatric file? She asked. Another pause. That S where it started, Dominic said. Camila's grip tightened slightly on the phone. What started? The pattern, he replied. Silence! Camila returned to her desk and sat down again. You retelling me a child's medical record is connected to a modern pharmaceutical distribution network spanning multiple hospitals. I am telling you, Dominic said carefully, that systems designed to move things efficiently rarely differentiate between what they are moving. That sentence landed differently than the rest, not because it was complex, but because it was disturbingly logical. Camila closed her eyes briefly. That does explain Sicilian. No, Dominic agreed. Then explain it. A pause. This one lasted longer than the others. When he spoke again,
Hey,
his voice had changed slightly, not in tone, but in restraint. There was a man involved, he said. Years ago, he believed language training was a form of behavioral anchoring. He used it to create familiarity in environments where identity could not be verified through documentation. Camila opened her eyes slowly. That sounds like conditioning. It was, Dominic said. She stepped away from the desk slightly. And the child in the file? Another pause. When people disappear into systems like this, Dominic said, they don't always disappear physically. Sometimes they are redistributed. Camila frowned. Redistributed. Yes, like assets. Yes. The simplicity of his answers made it worse. Camila looked at the pediatric file again. And you think I was part of that. I think you were near it, Dominic corrected. That S not the same thing. It becomes the same thing over time, he said. Silence. Camilla felt something shift inside her, not emotion, not panic, but a recalibration of assumptions. The kind she experienced in surgery when unexpected anatomy forced a complete reinterpretation of a procedure mid-operation. She spoke more quietly now. Why are you telling me this now? There was a pause. Then Dominic said, because I stopped looking too early. That sentence changed the air in the room. Camilla did not respond immediately. She stood still, phone pressed lightly against her ear, as if movement might disrupt the weight of what had just been said. You stopped looking, she repeated finally. Yes, for what? A long silence followed. When he answered, his voice was lower than before. For my daughter Hess, he said. Camila Tess' expression tightened slightly, though she did not speak. Dominic continued. I was told she died. I was shown records, reports, confirmations, and for a long time I believed that was the end of it. Camila moved slowly back toward her chair. But it was Teat, she said. No, he replied. Silence stretched between them again. Not uncomfortable. Heavy. Camila looked at the pediatric file on her screen. And now, another pause. Now I understand that what I was given was closure manufactured by systems that needed me to stop asking questions. Camila exhaled slowly. And you believe the system is the same looking at? I know it overlaps, Dominic said. Camila leaned forward slightly. Why would anyone go through that much effort to erase a child? A pause. Then Dominic said something that did not sound like theory. It sounded like memory. Because children are difficult to control unless they are integrated early, he said, and integration requires removal from original context. Camilla closed her eyes briefly. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. That S not just logistics. No, Dominic said, it never is. Silence followed. Camila opened her eyes again and looked at the city beyond her window. Do you believe she's still S? A long pause. This time, Dominic did not answer so immediately. When he finally did, his voice was different, not uncertain, but restrained. I believe I stopped asking that question too early, she said. Camila sniffed slowly. That's not an answer, she said. It's the only honest one I have left, Dominic replied. Silence. For the first time since their conversations began, the structure between them felt different. Less like observation, less like system alignment, something closer to shared fracture. Camila spoke carefully. If you were wrong as his lives is another pause. Then Dominic said, then she exists inside a system I'm no longer full control. That sentence carried weight beyond words. Camila turned slightly toward the window again. And you think I am connected to that system. I think you are closer to it than anyone else I've ever encountered in 20 years. He said. Silence again. Camila closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, her voice was steadier. What do you want me to do with this information? A pause. Then Dominic said, nothing yet. That answer surprised her more than anything else. Nothing, she repeated. Not yet, he confirmed. Camila turned back toward her desk slowly. Then why tell me? A longer pause followed. When Dominic spoke again, his voice had softened slightly, not emotionally, but in intent. Because people like you don't stay blind once they've seen structure, he said. And I need you to understand what you're re-seeing before someone else defines it for you. Camila looked at the pediatric file again. For the first time, she did not see it as isolated data. She saw it as a node, a point inside something larger, something unfinished, something still active. You afraid Salazar is involved, she said quietly. I am aware he benefits from the same blind spots, Dominic replied. Camila sat down slowly. And you're not sure how deep it goes. Another pause. No, he admitted. I am not. That admission changed something. Not because it showed weakness, but because it confirmed honesty. Camila leaned back in her chair. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she said quietly, if everything you saying is true, this isn't to start with us. No, Dominic said. It started earlier. Yes. Silence. Camila looked at her screen again. The pediatric file remained open. Still incomplete, still unresolved, still waiting. She spoke quietly. Then why did you stop searching? A long pause followed. When Dominic answered, his voice was almost indistinguishable from silence. Because I thought I already knew how the story ended, he said. Camila closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again. And for the first time since this began, she understood something she had not been willing to name. The story had never ended. It had only been paused. Now, with permission, it had started again. Camila Voss knew something had changed the moment she stepped into the hospital parking garage that morning. It wasn't dramatic. There were no obvious signs, no alarms, no visible security escalation, no unusual crowd of personnel. In fact, everything looked almost too normal, like a stage carefully reset after rehearsal, waiting for an audience that had not yet realized the performance had already begun. But Camila had spent enough time inside operating rooms and broken systems to understand that danger rarely announced itself in advance. It adjusted the environment until it felt familiar, and then it struck from inside familiarity itself. She paused near her car for a fraction of a second longer than usual. That was enough. A black sedan idled near the far exit ramp, engine running, positioned at an angle that did not match typical parking behavior. Not aggressive, not overt, just observant. The kind of positioning that did not say threat but rather says awareness missed, made react outwardly. Instead, she continued walking. Her phone was already in her hand but before she reached the hospital entrance. Yes, she said quietly when she answered. I told you not to go anywhere alone, Dominic Reyes replied. His voice carried something sharper than usual, not urgency, but containment, like someone forced restraint over a system that was beginning to accelerate beyond control. Not alone, Camila said, a pause. You are in a controlled perimeter, he corrected. Camila stepped inside the hospital lobby. That sounds like semantics again. This time it isn't, he said. She stopped near the elevator bank. Explain. Another pause. When Dominic spoke again, his voice had shifted, slightly less observational, more operational. Salazar has accelerated his timeline, he said. He's no longer observing. He's activating leverage points. Camila's expression tightened slightly. Leverage points? People, he said, simply. A silence followed that was heavier than the words themselves. Camila stepped into the elevator but did not press a floor yet. Define people. Another pause. Then Dominic said, your colleague Nora Chen. Camila's hand stopped mid-motion. The elevator doors remained open. For a moment, she did not respond. Not because she didn't understand, but because she understood immediately. Say that again, she said quietly. Nora has been identified as a pressure vector, Dominic replied. They reattempting to isolate you faint extract precipitous disruption. Camilla pressed the closed door button, then immediately stepped back out. Her mind was already shifting not emotionally, but structurally. The way it did in surgery when unexpected bleeding required immediate reclassification of the entire procedure. You were saying she's in danger, Camilla said. I am saying she has already been approached, Dominic corrected. Camilla walked fast now, exiting the lobby through a side corridor. When? 48 hours ago, he said. And you didn't tell me? A pause. I needed confirmation before escalating, Dominic said. Camilla stopped walking. For the first time in all their conversations, there was something in her voice that sharpened not panic, not fear, but controlled anger. You decided the threshold for telling me what happens to my friend, she said. I decided the threshold for accuracy, he replied. That answer should have felt cold. Instead, it felt like truth spoken without apology. Camilla resumed walking. Where is she now? Hospital administration office, Dominic said. She questioned under the pretext of supply chain irregularities. Camilla turned sharply down a corridor she was originally headed toward. That is not her department. I know, he said. Silence followed. Camilla's pace increased. Are they detaining her? She asked. Not officially, Dominic replied. But she is not free to leave. That sentence changed the temperature of everything. Camilla stopped near a glass window overlooking a restricted wing of the hospital. Her reflection looked calm, but inside something had shifted into alignment with urgency. What do they want from her? She asked. Access, Dominic said. To what? A pause. To you. Silence. Camilla closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, her voice was steady. I'm going there, she said. No, Dominic replied immediately. Camilla moved again. You didn't get to stop that. Another pause, this one longer, heavier. Then Dominic said, if you enter that room without structure, you will confirm exactly what they are trying to prove. Camilla stopped again. What is that? She asked. That you are not isolated, he said. That you are connected. Silence. Camilla looked toward the administrative wing down the hall. Her voice lowered slightly. I am connected. Yes, Dominic said, but not in the way they want you to be seen. Camilla exhaled slowly. And what way is that? A pause. Then Dominic said something that carried more weight than anything before. Family-level linkage, he said. Camilla froze, not emotionally. Structurally, that phrase was not random. It was classification. You think they know, she said quietly. I think they are testing the hypothesis, he replied. Camilla looked down the corridor again. Now it was to just concern. It was clarity. If Salazar's network had shifted from observation to activation, then Nora wasn't just leverage. She was a probe, a controlled pressure point designed to force reaction. And Kamala's reaction would define classification. You need to stay as of sight, Dominic said. That's not an option, she replied. It is if you want control of outcome, he said. Camilla moved again, faster now. Control of outcome has already been taken from her. A pause. Then Dominic said, not yet. That word mattered. Not yet. It implied timing still existed. Camilla reached the administrative wing entrance. Two security officers stood outside the door. They were not hospital security. Too still, too focused, too unfamiliar with environment cues. Camilla stopped at a distance that looked calm. Her voice remained calm when she spoke into the phone. Outside the room, she said. I know, Dominic replied. A silence followed. Then Camilla said, what do I do? Another pause. For the first time, Dominic didn't answer immediately. When he spoke, his voice was lower. You observe first, he said. Camilla frowned slightly. That it? You observe first, he repeated. Because they are watching for escalation signatures. Camilla's eyes narrowed slightly. She understood. If she entered aggressively, it confirmed dependency. If she hesitated, it confirmed uncertainty. But observation without reaction and controlled presence introduced unpredictability. Camilla shifted her posture slightly, then walked forward. The security officers watched her approach. No reaction yet. She stopped just short of the door. Inside, voices were audible but indistinct. She spoke quietly into the phone. They re not asking questions, she said. They are confirmed structure, Dominic replied. Camila's gaze stayed fixed on the door handle. Then she asked, if I go in, what happens? A pause. Then Dominic said, they will offer you a narrative. Camila frowned slightly. About what? About your origin, he said. Silence. Camila felt something tighten, not fear, but recognition. This was no longer about supply chains. It was about identity architecture. She spoke quietly. And Nora, a pause, is the incentive, Dominic said. Camila closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. Her voice changed slightly, not louder, but sharper. If they use her as leverage, I remove their leverage, she said. That is Ekas, Dominic replied. I know, she said. A silence followed. Then Dominic said something that felt different. Not instruction, not warning, alignment. Then do it. Precisely, he said. Camila ended the call. She stood still for 3 seconds. Then she opened the door. The room inside was brighter than expected. Too bright. Intentional. Nora sat in a chair across from 2 hospital administrators and one man Camila did not recognize. Nora's posture was controlled, but her hands were tense. Not restrained, but psychologically contained. When Camila entered, every head turned. That was expected. What wasn't expected, what Camila immediately noticed, was that the unknown man did not look surprised. He looked confirmed. Camila closed the door behind her, voice slowly. Why is my colleague here? She asked calmly. One of the administrators smiled faintly. Dr. Voss, he said. We were just discussing system integrity. Camila stepped further into the room. Her eyes moved briefly to Nora, then back to the man she didn't recognize. Urides is not hospital staff, Camila said. No, the man replied calmly. Silence followed. Then he added something that shifted the entire room. But I've been looking forward to meeting you. Camila held his gaze, and for the first time since this began, she understood exactly what Dominic meant by one phrase. They are not observing anymore. They are identifying. The moment Camila Voss stepped fully into the room, she understood something she had not allowed herself to acknowledge until that second. This was not an interrogation in the traditional sense. There were no visible restraints, no overt threats, no raised voices or obvious intimidation tactics. Everything about the environment was designed to suggest professionalism, procedure, and institutional neutrality. And yet, every detail was calibrated. The lighting was too even, eliminating shadows that could offer psychological refuge. The seating arrangement formed a subtle imbalance of authority, with Nora Chen positioned slightly off-center, isolated, without being physically separated. The unknown man, who had spoken first, sat with a posture that suggested patience rather than urgency, as if time itself was on his side. Camila did not move further into the room immediately. She paused just inside the doorway, not hesitation, assessment. Her gaze shifted briefly to Nora. Nora's eyes met hers for only a second, but in that second, Camila understood everything that mattered. Nora was not physically harmed, but she was under pressure, controlled, measured, and contained by implication rather than force. That kind of pressure was more dangerous than visible violence because it left no immediate evidence and created doubt in the victim's own perception of reality. Camila turned her attention to the unknown man. He looked to be in his late 40s, dressed in an intentionally avoided distinction. Not corporate, not medical, not law enforcement, something more ambiguous. The kind of ambiguity that was itself a strategy. His expression carried no hostility. That was the most important detail. People who relied on intimidation often revealed it early. People who relied on certainty did not need to. Camila spoke first. I asked why my colleague is here, she said evenly. One of the administrators leaned forward slightly, adopting a tone that suggested reassurance. This is a standard compliance discussion regarding irregularities in controlled substance purchasing. Camila didn't look at him. Her eyes remained on the unknown man. That is not a reason to detain a neurologist during work hours, she said. A small silence followed. Not uncomfortable. Measured, the unknown man finally spoke. We are not detaining anyone, he said calmly. Camila's expression did not change. Then she is free to leave. A pause. Nora shifted slightly in her chair but said nothing. The administrator responded again, slightly more careful this time. Dr. Chen is assisting us voluntarily. Camila turned her head just enough to acknowledge him, then returned her attention to the man. Voluntarily, under what conditions? She asked. The man leaned back slightly, as if appreciating the structure of her questions. Under the condition of clarification, he said. Camila's voice remained steady. Clarification of what? This time, smiled faintly. Your role, he said. The phrase landed differently than anything before it. Not accusation. Definite attempt. Camila stepped further into the room now, slowly, deliberately. She did not take a seating implied participation in their framing. Standing preserved control of her own positional authority. I don't have a role in whatever this is, she said. The man nodded once, as if acknowledging the expected response. That is what most people believe before they understand structure, he replied. Camila tilted her head slightly. Structure of what? A pause followed. Then he said, systems that distribute responsibility without transparency. Camila did not respond immediately. Instead, she observed him more carefully. His language was too refined for improvisation. He was not here to intimidate. He was here to classify her response patterns. That realization shifted the entire encounter. This was not interrogation in search of truth, it was evaluation in search of categorization. Camila exhaled slowly. You retesting whether I react sensibly, she said. A faint flicker in his expression, almost approval. I am observing how you define yourself under pressure, he corrected. Silence is followed. Nora's eyes shifted between them, tension visible in the subtle tightening of her jaw. Camila finally spoke again. If this is about hospital compliance, I want access to documentation, she said. One of the administrators opened a folder on the table. That will be provided in due course, he replied. Camila nodded slightly, then turned her attention back to the man. You haven't introduced yourself, she said. A brief pause. Then he answered. Victor Salazar, he said. The name did not create shock for Camila. It created alignment. Not emotional response. Structural recognition. She had heard the name before, not directly in conversation, but through pattern references, indirect mentions, and now finally, convergence. Camila repeated it once quietly. Salazar. Yes, he said. Camila studied him for a moment longer. You read not hospital compliance. No, he agreed. Then what are you doing here? Salazar's expression remained calm. Maintaining system balance, he said. Camila almost smiled, but not out of humor. Out of recognition of narrative framing. That's a very broad justification, she said. It is a necessary one, he replied. Silence stretched between them. Then Camila shifted her stance slightly, redistributing weight evenly. You reusing my facility to reach me, she said. Salazar did not deny it. Instead, he nodded once. Yes, he said simply. That confirmation changed the tone of the room. Nora's posture tightened. Camila noticed immediately. But she did not look at Nora this time. She kept her focus on Salazar. Then you already know I want to respond to pressure through third parties, Camila said. A pause. Then Salazar replied, That is why we are not applying pressure. Camila tilted her head slightly. You re-holding her here. We are asking questions, he corrected. Camila's voice lowered slightly. Questions that require her presence during work hours, with restricted communication and administrative oversight in the room. Salazar nodded once. Yes, he said. Silence followed again. Camila understood the structure now. This was not coercion in the traditional sense. It was behavioral mapping. They were measuring her reaction thresholds, identifying emotional anchors, mapping her responses to external stimuli. Nora was not leverage in the crude sense. She was a variable in a controlled environment. Camila spoke quietly. You rebuilding a profile, she said. Salazar's expression did not change. We are refining understanding, he corrected. Camila took steps clear to the table. Understanding of what? Salazar looked at her directly now. Whether you are isolated, he said. Silence. That word mattered. Isolated. It implied connection was the variable under investigation. Camila exhaled slowly. Behind her, Nora shifted slightly again, her breathing controlled but shallow. Instead, she said, You re's assuming connection. We are testing for it, Salazar replied. Camila nodded once, slowly. Then she said something that changed the temperature of the room entirely. Then, you are testing the wrong hypothesis, she said. A pause followed. Salazar's eyes narrowed slightly, not in aggression, but recalibration. Camila continued. If I were connected to external systems in the way you are implying, I would not be standing here alone, Shia said. I would not be the only point of contact. That would be inefficient. Silence. Camila's voice remained calm. I am not a node in a distributed structure, she said. I am a single operator in a contained environment. That sentence landed differently. It reframed everything. Salazar studied her carefully now. You believe that, he said. I know that, she replied. A pause followed. Then Salazar leaned forward slightly. Then explained Dominic Reyes, he said. That was the pivot. Camila did not react immediately, but internally, she registered the shift. This was no longer about hospital systems. This was about mapping relational exposure. She responded carefully to Gauss. Dominic Reyes is not part of my professional structure, she said, slightly. Yet he contacts you directly. Camila did not deny it. Silence stretched again. Nora's eyes shifted subtly toward Camila. That detail mattered. Salazar noticed it too. Camila spoke again before he could capitalize on it. If you are attempting to classify my communication patterns, she said, you will find them consistent with consultation boundaries. Salazar smiled faintly. That is not what we are observing, he said. Camila held his gaze. Then you are observing incorrectly, she replied. A pause. Then Salazar stood slowly. The movement was not threatening. It was concluding. We are done for now, he said. Camila didn't move. Nora exhaled slightly, tension loosening but not disappearing. Salazar looked at Camila one final time. You are more interesting than expected, he said. Camila's response was immediate. That is not a clinical category, she says. For the first time, something genuine amusement passed across his expression. No, he agreed. It is not. He turned toward a door. The administrators followed. Nora hesitated for a moment longer. Then she stood. When the room finally emptied, Camila and Nora were alone. Silence has returned. But this time it was different. Not controlled, not observed, just empty. Nora finally spoke. That was not about hospital compliance, she said quietly. Camila nodded once. No, Nora looked at her. Who was that man, she asked. Camila hesitated for only a fraction of a second. Then she answered. Someone who is trying to understand what I am connected to, she said. Nora swallowed slightly. And are you? Camille looked at her for a long moment, then said quietly, no. But even as she said it, she understood something had already changed. Because outside the room, systems did not stop evaluating. They simply moved to the next phase. Camila Voss did not leave the hospital immediately after the encounter with Victor Salazar. Instead, she stayed inside the building long after her shift technically ended, moving through familiar corridors that now felt subtly altered, as if the structure itself had absorbed the tension of what had just happened and was quietly rearranging its internal meaning around it. People around her continued working as usual. Nurses moved between rooms. Doctors discussed cases in low voices. Monitors beeped steadily in patient wards. And administrative staff pretended, as institutions always do, that nothing fundamental had shifted. But Camila understood something most people never fully accepted. Systems did not reveal change at the moment of impact. They revealed it afterward, in delayed consequences, in behavioral echoes, in the small stressors that began to accumulate where stability had once been assumed. Nora Chen had been released from the room without formal restriction. No explanation had been given beyond vague references to clarification complete, which in institutional language meant nothing and everything at the same time. Nora had not spoken much after that. She had simply looked at Camila for a long moment before returning to her department, as if trying to place her into a version of reality that else made sense. Camila did not stop her. There are moments when reassurance is not yes, because it would require a level of certainty that no longer exists. By the time Camila reached her office, it was nearly 8:30 p.m. The hospital had shifted into its quieter phase, where urgency still existed, but was distributed more evenly across fewer people. She closed the door behind her and stood still for a moment, not sitting down, not turning on additional lights, simply allowing herself to register the absence of immediate external pressure. Then her phone rang. She already knew before she answered. Yes, she said. Still inside the hospital, Dominic Reyes replied. It was not a question. Camila moved slowly toward the window. You already know that. Yes, he said. But I wanted to hear it from you. That statement should have felt intrusive. Instead, it felt deliberate. Camila looked out over Boston, where lights from surrounding buildings created a layered cityscape of reflection and distance. Salazar was here, she said. A pause followed on the line. I know, Dominic replied. Camila turned slightly. You didn't warn me in time. Another pause. I did have confirmation of proximity until he engaged you directly, he said. Camila exhaled slowly. You mean until I became useful data? A silence followed that was heavier than usual. Then Dominic said, You were never just data. Camila didn't respond immediately, not because she disagreed, but because she was no longer certain what category she belonged to in any system that involved him. She finally spoke. He tried to classify me. I expected that, Dominic said. Camila narrowed her eyes slightly. You expected it? Yes, why? A pause. Then Dominic said, Because people like Salazar don't look for truth. They look for structure they can control. Camila leaned against the window frame. And what did he find? He said. Silence followed. When Dominic answered, his voice was quieter. Resistance, he said. Camila frowned slightly. That's not a category. It is to him, Dominic replied. That answer stayed with her longer than expected. There was a brief silence before Camila spoke again. Nora is going to ask questions. I know, Dominic said. Clucken looked down at her reflection in the glass. And I don't know what I can tell her. Another pause. Then Dominic said something shifted the weight of the conversation. Tell her as little as necessary to keep her safe, he said. Camila turned slightly. That sounds like avoidance. It's containment, he corrected. Camila closed her eyes briefly, that S becoming your favorite word. Because it S, the only thing preventing collapse right now, he replied. Silence followed. Camila opened her eyes again. Salazar knows I'm not isolated. Yes, Dominic said. And he thinks that means I am part of something larger. In a pause. Yes, he confirmed again. Camila walked slowly back to her desk and sat down. Is he wrong? That question hung in the air longer than the others. When Dominic finally answered, his voice was more measured. He is incomplete, he said. Camilla nodded slightly to herself. That is not reassuring. It is accurate, he replied. Silence. Camila looked at her hands for a moment, as if expecting them to provide clarity. They did not. What happens next? She asked, a pause. Then Dominic said, escalates observation or he shifts strategy. Camila frowned. Which one is more likely? Strategy shift, he said. Meaning? Another pause. Isolation attempts become indirect, Dominic replied. They will stop engaging you as a single target and begin influencing your environment instead. Camila understood immediately, not because he explained it well, but because she had already seen the beginning of it. Nora. She spoke quietly. They will go through people around me. Yes, Dominic said. Camila exhaled slowly. Then this doesn't stop at work. No, he replied. Silence followed. Camila leaned back slightly in her chair. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to think not in fragments of systems or procedures, but in continuity. If Salazar was escalating, then everything she had assumed was static was now dynamic. The hospital was no longer just a workplace. Nora was no longer just a colleague. Dominic was no longer just a voice on the phone. Everything had become interconnected in ways that were not visible, unless you knew how to look for structure beneath surface neutrality. She spoke quietly. I need clarity on one thing. Ask, Dominic said. A pause. Camila chose her words carefully. When you said I was close to your system, was that metaphorical or literal? Silence followed immediately, longer than before. When Dominic answered, his voice was lower. Both, he said. Kapla closed her eyes briefly. That was not an answer that resolved uncertainty. It expanded it. She opened her eyes again. That doesn't help me define boundaries. There are no clean boundaries anymore, he replied. That sentence carried a different kind of weight. Not threatening, not comforting. Final in structure. Camus stood a step slowly and walked back toward the window. Outside, Boston continued moving as if none of this existed. People ate dinner, traffic flowed, buildings illuminated themselves against the night. The world maintained its illusion of separation between systems that were actually layered and interdependent. She spoke quietly. What do you want me to do? There was a pause. Then Dominic said it survived the interpretation phase. Camila frowned slightly. That S not actionable. It is the most important phase, he replied. Silence followed. Camila looked at her reflection again. For a moment, she didn't see a surgeon. She did see a professional. She saw someone standing at the edge of a system that was beginning to define her, be fully understood its language. And that realization was more unsettling than fear, because fear implied distance. This did not feel distant anymore. It felt adjacent. She spoke softly. And after that, another pause. Then Dominic said, "We rebuild context." Camila's let out a slow breath. That sounds like something that should have been there from the beginning. It was, he said. Camila turned slightly. Then why am I only seeing it now? A pause. Then Dominic said that stayed with her longer than anything else. Because systems don't reveal themselves to participants, he said. They reveal themselves to those who survive long enough to see structure instead of function. Silence followed. Camila did not respond immediately, because for the first time, she understood the implication of that sentence. This was no longer about discovery, it was about endurance. And somewhere in the distance between what she had been told and what she was now beginning to see, the system was still moving quietly, deliberately, and without concern for whether she was ready to understand it. The city felt different on the morning after everything had changed, even though nothing visible had actually changed at all. Boston still moved, with its usual rhythm traffic flowing through the arteries of downtown. Hospital shifts, beginning before sunrise, people walking past each other with the practiced indifference of those who believed their lives were separate from larger systems they never paused to question. But for Camila Voss, nothing looked isolated anymore. Everything looked connected, not in a dramatic, cinematic way. There were no sudden visions lighting up the sky, no clear endings or neatly resolved answers. What she had instead was something more unsettling: continuity. The sense that what she had seen was not an event, but a layer finally becoming visible after years of being hidden beneath ordinary perception. She arrived at the hospital early, as she always did. The corridors were quiet, the lighting soft and artificial, the air carrying that familiar sterile mix of antiseptic and controlled urgency. But today, she noticed the small things differently. The way staff avoided certain administrative doors, the way security presence had subtly shifted to positions, the way conversations paused just a fraction too quickly when she entered a room. Nothing was stated, everything was implied. And implication, she was learning, was how systems protected themselves. In her office, she placed her bag down carefully and stood still for a moment before sitting. The pediatric file was no longer open on her screen, but it did not feel closed either. Some information, once seen, never truly returned to storage. It simply changed location inside the mind, becoming part of the structure through which all new information had to pass. Her phone vibrated once. She did not need to check it to know. "Yes," she said quietly. "I am outside," Dominic Reyes replied. Camila closed her eyes briefly, then stood. She did not ask why he was there. She no longer asked questions like that. Some presences did not require explanations once their role in the system had been partially understood. When she reached the hospital entrance, she saw him waiting, not imposing, not hidden, simply present in a way that made the surrounding environment feel slightly more organized by contrast. He did not move immediately when she approached. He simply observed her, as he always did, as if confirming continuity rather than checking arrival. "You early," she said. "So are you," he replied. A pause. It wasn't a confrontation. It wasn't comfort either. It was recognition. They walked together without direction for a moment, moving away from the main entrance into a quieter side corridor near the hospital gardens. The air outside was colder, sharper, more honest than the filtered environments inside. Neither of them spoke first. There were conversations that no longer required urgency because urgency had already done its work. Finally, Camila spoke. "Salazar has contacted me again," she said. "He won tea immediately," Dominic replied. "Come on." Kala glanced at him. "That's not reassuring." "It's expected," he said. They stopped near a low wall overlooking a small courtyard. Leaves moved slightly in the morning wind, indifferent to whatever human structures had been built above them. Camila folded her arms loosely. Nora asked questions, she said. I assumed she would, Dominic replied. She doesn't understand any of it. Most people don't, he said. Camila looked forward. She thinks I'm involved in something I can explain. Is she wrong? Dominic asked. Camila didn't answer immediately, because the truth was no longer simple enough to categorize as yes or no. After a moment, she said, she is not fully correct. That's enough, he replied. A silence followed. Then Camila spoke again, quieter this time. Where does this end? She asked. Dominic did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but different from before, not uncertain but less contained. It does end cleanly, he said. Caz nodded slightly as if she had expected that answer. Then what is it? She asked. A pause. Continuation with awareness, he said. Camila let out a slow breath. That sounds like survival, she said. It is, he replied. They stood in silence again, watching the courtyard below. Somewhere in the distance, a hospital alarm sounded briefly, then resolved. Life continuing its functions without interruption. Camila finally turned slightly toward him. You stopped searching once, she said. Yes, he replied. And now? A pause. Then Dominic said, now I understand that stopping did change what existed. It only delayed recognition. Camila studied him for a moment. For the first time, she saw not just control or calculation, but something closer to exhaustion shaped into discipline. She spoke quietly. If this connects to me the way you believe it does, she said, then it does just change my past. It changes your future, he finished. Camila nodded once. Not agreement, acknowledgement. A silence followed. Then she said something that was not a question and not a statement, but something in between. I don't want to lose myself in this, she said. Dominic looked at her directly. You want tea? He said. It was the first time he had spoken with certainty that was not about systems. Camila held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she looked away, toward the city, beyond the hospital walls. The world was still there, still moving, still pretending it was simple. But she no longer believed in simplicity the way she used to. And perhaps that was the real change, not what had been discovered, not what had been revealed, but what could no longer be unseen. Camila adjusted her coat slightly. Then we do this carefully, she said, a faint pause. Then Dominic replied, we already are. And for the first time, neither of them added anything after that. The characters, settings, and events portrayed in this story are entirely fictional. While certain themes may echo real-life experiences, they are shaped by creative interpretation. The author does not intend to represent or depict any specific individual, organization, or historical event.
This story is not really about a mafia boss, nor is it truly about crime, violence, or power in the way most people expect when they hear those words. On the surface, it may look like a world built around hidden networks, controlled systems, and dangerous men operating behind closed doors. But underneath that surface, the real subject of this story is something far more universal. How truth, identity, and human connection survive inside systems designed to control perception. At its core, the story of Camila Voss and Dominic Reyes is about what happens when a person realizes that their life has been quietly shaped by decisions they never saw being made. Camila begins as someone who believes in structure, logic, and professional control. She trusts systems, medical systems, institutional systems, and the idea that truth is something you can isolate and verify. But she slowly discovers that not all systems are built for transparency. Some are built for influence, protection, and survival, and once she sees that, she cannot unsee it. Dominic represents a different kind of intelligence, not emotional chaos or brute force, but the discipline of understanding people as systems within systems. Yet even he is not untouched by consequence. His strength is not that he controls everything, but that he has learned how little control truly exists when human lives are involved. The story quietly challenges the idea that power makes someone invulnerable. Instead, it shows that power often comes with the deepest kind of lost distance. Isolation and the burden of knowing too much. The moral lesson here is not about fear, but awareness. It reminds us that every environment, whether it is a workplace, a relationship, or society itself, has invisible structures shaping behavior. Most people live inside those structures without ever questioning them. But growth begins at the moment you start recognizing that influence exists even when it is not visible. Another important lesson is emotional discipline. Camilla does not survive this world because she is the strongest physically, but because she learns to observe before reacting. She learns that clarity is more powerful than impulse, and that understanding a situation fully is often the difference between control and collapse. Finally, the story speaks about connection. Even in systems built on manipulation and strategy, human relationships remain the one element that cannot be fully predicted or controlled. Trust, loyalty, and truth, when they appear, become more powerful than any structure built to contain them. In the end, this is not a story about mafia power. It is a story about seeing reality clearly, acting with intention, and understanding that the most dangerous thing in any system is not the system itself, but the moment you finally understand how it works.